Feel free to ask questions during the the session, and let's keep this interactive so it's not like one way I'm just talking becomes a little of a drag. So let's get started right away. Is my screen visible already? I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, great. All right, so let me switch into slides. Okay, brilliant. So welcome everyone to this talk about contract-driven development with Specmatic, transforming your API specifications into executable contracts, that too in seconds. So I'll break this down slowly one by one as we go. There's a lot of words in there. So let's get started. So quickly apart from the introduction that Nilanjan and Precious just gave about me, personally, I'm very passionate about conferences and communities, and I love participating, speaking, and volunteering at conferences. So these are some of the conferences that I've been a part of, and I'm honored to be a part of this as well. And thanks again for Tublian to invite me here. The second one is I currently am the co-founder and CTO at Specmatic, the tool that we'll be using, the open source tool that we'll be using during the course of this talk. That aside, I do help companies, both large enterprises and unicorn startups, in their transformation journey, adopting cloud transformation or extreme programming, agile and lean. And that's my ubiquitous handle across the board, Hare Krishnan83. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. So that's quickly about me. With that aside, let's talk about what today's topic is about, and what is contract-driven development. Why are we even here talking about it? All right. So let's say we're building a mobile application, which obviously requires some sort of a backend application to get the details from. So let's say this is an e-commerce app which requests product details and then displays the same on the screen. Sounds extremely straightforward, right? What could potentially go wrong with this? And just to get some terminology clear, the application requesting data, let's call it the consumer, and the backend, which is providing the data, we'll call it the provider. Now, with that terminology out of the way, let's look at how we'd go about building the consumer. So I'm going to put myself into the shoes of the UI and the mobile app developer. And let's say if I have to start building it, and then I realize my dependency, which is the actual backend, which needs to give me the product details, that is not yet built. So let's say I'm sitting out of Bangalore, I'm trying to build this mobile application, and my counterpart is sitting in San Francisco, and they have not yet started building it. So I can't just wait until they are done, right, with the backend and then start building my front end. So what I do, typically an accepted practice in the industry, is I can mock that provider. I don't need the real application to work with. Instead, I use tools like that are available to quickly say, I'll spin up my local machine. If I give you this request, give me back that response, and that's it. I can get on with my work. I already know that if I request for product ID, I get back some certain amount of data. This information is already available to me, basis which I make progress. This sounds great, right? It's a very viable option. Does any of you see a problem in this approach, or is this okay for me to do? There are no wrong answers, no right answers here. So please feel free to say yes or no. You could put that down in the chat. Okay. Most of you think it's okay. It's a good approach, right? I'm not twiddling my thumb waiting for things to be done. And I'm taking a proactive step to move forward. So when they are done, I'll integrate it with them. However, there's a big problem here, right? So sorry for walking you into that. There's a problem here, which is the fact that the mock I created, it is potentially possible and very, very likely that it is not equivalent to the real application, right? When I start integrating with the real backend, I might run into the problem. Why is this so? For example, when I'm creating the mock, I may be making assumptions, which I should be, right? And those assumptions could be that I can send the ID as a string, right? And the backend, when the developers build it, they are expecting the ID to be a number, right? So that's the first mismatch. The second thing is maybe the provider, they are planning to send the name and the stock keeping unit, SKU, of the product, right? Whereas me on the consumer side, when I'm building the mobile application, I assumed that they're going to be sending the name and the price. I made an error, right? Human error is possible. And so if I made such wrong assumptions and I created the temporary mock server, then I end up in trouble. And now when I put these, when the backend team is also ready, and when I put off both of these applications together and start testing, then I realize there is an integration issue. Very typical issue. All of us have seen this problem. Relatable? Yes, no? Cool. Very, very relatable, right? I heard a few people. There was, I think, Frederick, who was the backend developer. I think there was one more gentleman who was a front-end developer. We've all seen this, right? So how do we like not get into this situation? That's the point. But before we get into not getting into the situation, where do you find such issues? So like I said, I'm sitting in Bangalore. I'm building this application on my laptop. I'm all good with the mock. And maybe I'll push the code also to the CI, continuous integration server. Someone will, the same test which I'm using on my local machine, I'm running it there also. I'll not find the issue there. So I'm very happy that I have a green build. I've done my job. All that is great. Likewise, even my counterpart sitting in San Francisco, they're building the backend. They're also very happy. He's able to run it on his local machine there, and his CI build is also passing. So we both believe that, hey, we've done a good job. Let's deploy to integration testing. And that's when we find the issue. Now, both of us are like in a little bit of a problem, right? Because first of all, this environment itself is broken now because I can't test any other feature. Both this application, the front end and the back end, are not even talking for a simple, get product. Maybe other things I have to proceed to it. First, I have to get past the screen. If the screen is broken, I can't test the remaining pieces, right? And so far, I'm just showing you just a simple mobile app and a backend. But in a realistic environment, you'll have hundreds and hundreds of services and front ends and micro front ends and microservices. And just two of them could potentially bring down the entire environment, which means now you end up having no way to release. And that means your end users are not going to be very happy, right? And for me, I have to sit and rework the whole piece, right? Like maybe my counterpart, he has to go and fix it. He or she has to fix it, and say, I will change it according to what you want. Or maybe I am the one who erroneously made the mistake of assuming what is the ID and what is the response. So I'll have to fix it on my side. Then both of us have to deploy, then redo the testing. Then the QA have to also spend all the effort again. So this is not very productive, right? That's what this heat map is about at the bottom. If I had found the issue here, it is very green. I can finish it quickly. I'll rework. Not going to take more than a few minutes, maybe hours, and I'll be done. But this, maybe I finished on Monday, I deployed on Tuesday and only found this issue on Wednesday. So again, 3-day gap or maybe even a week gap, I'll have to rework. So that's the problem. So far, so good. This is what we want to get out of. Everyone clear with the problem, right? Any questions so far? What we want to stop? To summarize, we want to avoid, identifying compatibility issues between components, let's say mobile and backend, in the integration or late in the cycle. I want to find it early. How do I do that? Okay, cool. I got one clear. I am assuming the rest of you are also understanding and following along. So once this concept is clear, the rest of it is going to be easy. So I want to be able to do this without integration testing. So we all understand what integration testing is, right? Integration testing is when I have all my pieces, I put it together, and then I test them, right? It's like taking a car. I have all the wheels, I have the engine, I have the steering column, I have my music player, I have my sunroof. I put it all together, and then I sit in the car, and then I ask you to drive, right? Will you be happy doing it if I've not tested anything individually? Maybe, maybe not. It's not a very safe car, right? So if I find an issue in the display, in the music system, then I have to redo the whole thing. I have to bring the car apart and then do it. Instead, what I want to do is I want to find the issue first, even before I put the car together. Precisely, like what Nilanjan put it in the chat. Right? So let's think about what we want to do. So like I said, front end, back end, we reached an agreement, right? That I'll send you the ID, you send me some data back. The problem happened in the fact that we were not very clear in articulating what was, what is this particular agreement? So maybe it's just an error of communication, right? Maybe I'll take an example. Let's say Precious and I were developing this. Precious is developing the backend. I'm developing the front end. Sorry, Precious, to put you on the spot. So let's say you mentioned integer for the ID, but I mistook it to be a string, right? So I am going to, I made the mistake of assuming it wrong, and it's okay. I mean, it's human to make an error. So we were all like, oh, I said this, you said that, and it's going to be that kind of situation. But what if we could put it down into a documentation? Most of us might say, okay, I can put it in an email, so we are very clear about it. But the problem there is, what is the standard format? Do I write it in text? Do I say, now in ID is a number, and that is not very clear, right? ID could be an integer, ID could be a float, ID could be a GUID, we don't know. Now, all of that is very hard to express in free text. So which is why you need something called an API specification. And specifically what I'm going to be covering today is this particular specification called OpenAPI, right? Anyone who's been doing any programming in the past 5 to 10 years, you're all aware of APIs, and OpenAPI is ubiquitous now, considering it has become the de facto industry standard for documenting API behavior. What are the paths? What are the methods available? What are the operations available? And what is the data you will receive? I'll go deep into the OpenAPI specification itself in a bit. But what I'm suggesting in this diagram is we don't stop at agreeing verbally or textually that this is what the contract between the front end and the back end is, right? Instead, what we do is we put it down into an OpenAPI specification. Why is this good? Because if we do that, then I could potentially reference this and build my front end. And likewise, let's say Precious wants to build the backend, he can also reference the same file. And we both have a unambiguous, very clear, crystal clear file which we can depend on. And how would we do this? This is where Specmatic comes in, right? An API specification is just documentation, right? It is not in the format of maybe free text like an email. It is just in the format of a YAML or a JSON, correct? It's practically just documentation which is machine parsable. But having an API specification in itself does not make it enforceable. So a specification by itself is not a contract. What makes a specification a contract is the ability to enforce it. What do I mean by enforcing it, right? So say, suppose you have bought a house and you have a piece of paper saying this property belongs to Mr. X or Mrs. Y or Miss Y, right? That piece of paper has no value until someone from the government or someone from the, the precinct is able to say that this paper is valid and I will enforce their ownership of the house, right? Likewise, very similarly, the specification, someone has to enforce that the person building the backend is adhering to it and the person building the front end or the mobile app is also adhering to it. I'm trying to keep it only front end and back end and not go into microservices too much for simplicity's sake. But this contract concept is applicable across the board. Okay. So now let's get into this detail. So now that we have agreed on an API specification, we can pass it on to this tool called Specmatic, which is an open source tool that my team and I have built. We've been building this over the past 4 years, and we've been using it across several projects, and it's been very, very helpful for us in that circumstance. So how do I make, how does Specmatic help us in enforcing the API specification? So let's start with this. On the consumer, you remember the first step I did? I was trying to create a mock server, right? And use that as a way to emulate the provider until the provider is actually available. And so that I can make independent progress building the mobile application, correct? And the issue with that stub was that fellow was not in line with the actual provider. So if he deviated, if I made a mistake in assumption as to what is going to happen, integration will break. But now this stub server is significantly different from what we saw then, because Specmatic intelligent service virtualization, what it does, make sure that I'll never make such a mistake. I'll show that in a bit right now. It will make sure that my mock or stub server, which I stand up here, is exactly according to the specification that I agreed to. This is one side of the equation. On the provider side, what is going to happen is the same specification. I'll make sure Specmatic will run this as a test against the provider to make sure the provider is also adhering to their side of the bargain, right? So this is very similar to an electrical circuit. Each country has its own socket standards, right? Like say the European standard is the 3-pin standard or whatnot, and the US standard is the 2 flat pins. That is the standard, right? Now, if you want to manufacture electrical sockets or appliances which fit into the socket, you all agree to that particular standard of what is the thickness of the socket plugs, what is the depth of it, what is the metal that should be made of. That is the specification. Now the person building the socket will try to build one side, and the person building the appliance will build the other side as per specification. If they both agree, the socket and the plug meet well, right? So that's exactly what we're trying to achieve with contract driven development. So now enough of pictures and text, right? Let me jump into a demo, and then I'll show you what this whole thing means. Right. I'll stop here. Before the demo, any questions so far? Okay, I assume you're all following. All good? Okay, Akash says it's clear. I'm guessing you're saying it is clear, right? Okay, cool. Okay, so let's talk about intelligent service virtualization. And what do I mean by that? Now, remember I mentioned that we can agree on a API specification and then use that as a standard, right? So this is an open API specification. It has a couple of sections, a few sections, sorry. Let's look at what all it has, right? Like, let's leave the top level information. This is basically the information around what it is doing. Then the servers, again, this you can ignore for the moment. The important part is this section, which is called the paths. So it says, if I make a call to products with /ID, and then I will get back a response for a product which gives me back a name and an SKU, which is right here, correct? That's the 200 response. That's all we have documented right now. That's all we want to get done, correct? And this is very clear. I'll tell you why. Because when I say ID, I can define that the schema is a number, and I can say this is obviously required because it's part of the path parameter. And I can have some basic description as to what is going on. So this is helpful. And likewise in the response as well, I'm able to say the type and whether it's nullable, not nullable, required, not required. All of that is also here. So this is the OpenAPI specification. Now, again, I will go back to our original model of working, right? Precious is doing the backend, I'm doing the front end. So we both agreed on this specification. We need to move forward. What do I do as a mobile developer? I need to see if this API is even available for me to get started, fire up my Android Studio or iOS development environment and start building it. But before that, I need a mock server, right? Like what I was saying. So what I'm going to do is first go to Postman, just play around with it. I've imported this API specification into Postman. You can do that. So basically you go to import and you can select an OpenAPI file and it will just pull it in. That's pretty much it. And it will create the collection. Now it has detected the same thing, the product/ID, and then it has this ID field here. And I could try testing it. And of course, you will see that econ refused because there's no server. So where do I create my mock server? So what I'm going to do quickly here is launch a terminal. And let me go into this folder called service virtualization. We keep this expanded here. And I'm going to say Specmatic stub products.yaml. That's all I'm saying, right? And as you can see, Specmatic says I'm started on port 9000 and it's running there. Okay, so I go back to my Postman and then I say send. I have some ID here, 3. I can keep changing it, say 4. It really doesn't matter. Every time I send a different ID, you will see that the value here is changing and it's also random. because if I send 6 twice, this time it is KE and RQ, next time it's something else. Why is this? Who's sending this value? Where is this coming from? Did we write any code for this? Let's understand this. So what happened is Specmatic practically read through the specification and figured out that this is a string response. So I need to auto-generate some string value and send it back. So whenever it receives product/6, it matches this particular specification, which is a number, and it auto-generates the value and sends it back. Now, if I go here and modify this to say product and try asking it, it will say no, because it's not in the specification, correct? So even I could not make a typo in the URL, right? It's not possible. Whatever is in the OpenAPI spec is the only thing that will work. So far, so good. All I had to do is take in a specification. I can create a mock server simply by running Specmatic stub server command, right? Any questions so far? Move forward.
Harry, how do you create those specification files? Is it part of a discussion? Is an output of a meeting?
Right. It's a good question. All right. So usually OpenAPI specifications are created, you can do it in multiple ways, right? One is for you to, there are tools out there which you could use. For example, so my favorite tool is editor.swagger.io, which is the open source version of it. They have it online, and you can go there and edit your file and create the specification and bring it down. Typically, what happens is OpenAPI specifications are sometimes generated from code or generated out of some tool or traffic, etc. But that said, what we recommend in contract-driven development is to start with the API specification first. So you remember, right? So when you reach an agreement, you first draft your agreement in the form of an OpenAPI specification, and you can draft it manually. And it's actually fairly straightforward. The plugins I'm using here also, you can see that I can go and add a new path, and all of that is possible. And of course, with all the Copilot magic these days, like I'm currently using Cursor, which means I have everything in line to create stuff. So it's actually fairly easy to create the OpenAPI specification by hand.
Okay, cool.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Sure. All right. Okay, let's see. We were back here. I think our terminal is still running and our stub server is still going strong. Now on Postman, this doesn't make sense, right? I get some random value every time. I can't really build something useful with it. I want to get concrete values so I can make my mobile app look realistic and test with realistic data. So how do I do that? So now let me try doing something interesting. I'm going to say product ID 1, and I'm going to ask it, give me the data back. And what I get back is this name called Mythical Man Month, the book, and then the SKU is test. And any number of times I keep sending it, I'll get the same thing back. It's interesting, right? The rest of it was always auto-generating the values, but here it's not. And how is that? If you go back to my folder structure, you'll notice that this is my products.yaml API specification. Adjacent to that, I have this directory called products_data. So this underscore data is a naming convention. You can also bypass it. But inside this, I have this file called Mythical Man Month. And I have created this JSON, which is a request response mapping. Now, what do I mean by request response mapping? This is a very, very popular concept called canned responses, right? Which is basically given a request. I want to get back this response. That's all I'm saying. And for product 1, I have hard-coded that the response has to be Mythical Man Month. Now, likewise, I could create any number and say, let me rename this and say tdd.json. And then here I'd say product ID 2. Whenever I ask for it, I want to get back tdd by Kent. I could say this SKU is 123 ABC, something like that. And if I do this, what you will notice is Specmatic auto-reloaded my specification files and along with the stub data, which I just created. So now if I go back to Postman, I can simply say 2, and I'll always get back Kent Beck. And if I say 1, I'll always get back Mythical Mammoth. And any other number apart from this that I send, I'll get random values. So that's like service virtualization, right? So far, what I've shown you is still very basic, right? A lot of tools out there will allow you to do this. But what I'm going to show you now is the most interesting part, which is I'm going to make the mistake that I made the last time when I showed you, right? Which is I made an assumption, if I could go back to the slide, I made an assumption that I am going to be sending, I want to get back price and not the SKU. Correct? I made this wrong assumption and thereby set up the mock according to that, which all led to this whole hoopla here. So can I make that mistake now? Let's try. So instead of saying SKU here for TDD, right, I'm going to delete this and say, I'm going to give it price. And let's say it's a number, $20, okay? And I hit save. And automatically you see the auto reload happened here for tdd.json. And here is an error. Let's read through the error and understand what happened. It says, in scenario get products, returns products with ID, response body.price. The key name price in the stub was not in the contract. That makes sense because if I split right, and if I open the specification on the left, you notice that the schema here only has name and SKU. And here I'm trying to put name and price, which is my error which I had made earlier. And now Specmatic is disallowing me from making that mistake. It won't even load this, right? The only way I can fix this is if I go back to SKU and if I save it, only then it says it's okay at the bottom. So it's practically acting like guardrails that the agreement that we entered into, like this is the products.yaml and that's our contract between Prashant and I in building this mobile application. I cannot deviate from what I agreed with Precious. Make sense? I'll stop here. Is this concept clear? I want to make sure this is understood properly. Perfect. Thanks, Jeffrey. All right, cool. So what else can we do? Something interesting, right? So let's say you want to try what will happen to your mobile application. Let's say if the server is down or it's slow to respond, and your application should time out and say 3 seconds and show a message saying, hey, something's wrong. Can you try again later? So that's the behavior you want to try, right? But how would you test this? I can't go and ask the backend engineer here and to say, can you make your server slower? And then I'll try to test with it. Doesn't make sense to me, right? It's kind of difficult. Or I have to use some tools like a network sniffer or something, which will put a proxy in between, and I have to do something slightly more complicated to slow down the response and then thereby test my capability. So this is called like fault injection in the back end, right? And then test my application if it is really still resilient to that. So what I could do here is I could say delay in seconds and say, let's say 5 seconds. Sorry, my JSON is as pretty bad. So I'll say delay in seconds and it says 5 seconds. So for product 2, I want to say it has to take 5 seconds before it responds. Now let's look at how that behaves, right? Now if I go back to my Postman and I'll give the ID as 1 and our mythical man-month comes back immediately, right? Notice the time duration here, 15 milliseconds. But if I did this, it's going, it's still going, it's still going. And it came back exactly after 5 seconds. So I can do delay simulation, and similarly, I can do other sort of fault simulations like errors, and I can sort of push that. And thereby I'll be able to test like slightly more negative scenarios, right? Obviously, we want to get the basic page working and all that. But now I can do all this fancy stuff with fault injection, which makes my stubbing even more effective. So that's the part about this. So now I'll stop here. I want to make sure like this concept has sunk in clearly. What I was showing you so far is in this picture, the left-hand side of this equation, right? I've given Specmatic an OpenAPI specification, which is the agreement. And now at least the consumer is tightly bound to it. I cannot deviate. I cannot set up a wrong response. But within the boundary of the specification, I can play around with it. I can inject faults, try all my fancy stuff. But still, I have to adhere at a high level to the specification. This part, is it clear? Because then only then I can move to the next section. Otherwise, it'll be a little difficult to follow. All good? Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, now let's look at the right-hand side of this equation. Now we have to see how I keep this provider in line, right? How does the developer of the application make use of this? Now let's look at the, excuse me, this specification. I'll go back, I'll kill this stub server. Let's stop that and kill this also. Okay, so I have the specification. Now what I can do is I can start, I want to run this as a test against something. So let's say I can say Specmatic, and I'm going to say run contract test. I have a VS Code plugin, which I've installed already on my cursor. And then I'll pick this file. Basically, I'll take this YAML file. I'll copy the relative path, or I can put it in here. And let's say I have this localhost somewhere running an application. And then I hit save and run. And it says connection refused. Obviously, I don't have an application. It's going to say connection refused. But let's look at what happened here in the output. So what it did is it started running the test, and it figured out that it is trying to take a scenario, and it tried to make a request with this particular ID for this product. And then it tried to see whether it gets a response or not. Now, how is Specmatic doing all this? I'll quickly jump back to my slides. Show you this one. What Specmatic does is for the system under test, that's my provider application, I'm able to read the spec, and Specmatic is able to create test cases purely out of OpenAPI spec. And that will generate HTTP requests, get the response back, and validate the response if it is according to the specification. Right? Just try to stare at this image for a moment, because now I'll jump back into the code, and then I'll show you what it means. Okay. Right. So with that, this is what I ran, and it's connection refused because there is no application there. So let's build an application, right? So we're going to try doing something like test-driven development. I have tests purely based on API specification, and I have free tests. Who doesn't like free tests, right? I don't have to write them. I have the spec. Based on the spec, I have tests. So I could write my application now. Okay. So I have my IntelliJ here, and I have a blank application. I just created this few minutes ago. I went to this website, which is start.spring.io, which is my favorite for creating Spring Boot applications, of course. And I created a application from here, and that's what is loaded here. So it's practically blank. I'm gonna start running this application, and it's running on port 8080. Okay. So now I go back to my VS Code. I already have it pointing at 8080. So I'm going to run the test again. And this time around, it doesn't say connection refused. It says failure. I was expecting a 200, but I got a 404. Why is that? Any guesses? I'll run it again. The test ran. It says I ran one test, and it says the endpoint is not implemented. It's 404. Any guesses? Yeah, precisely. No API at that location. Thanks, Charan. So go back to the application. So let's actually build this application, right? I'm going to say get mapping. For those of you familiar with the backend Java Spring Boot, follow along. But otherwise, building this application, you don't have to build it in Java and all. you can build it in TypeScript, or you could do it with Golang, or you could do it with any language. Specmatic is completely tech stack and language agnostic. It's just an executable. And the code that I'm showing you back there is practically just a VS Code plugin, and underneath it's just a executable file. Okay, let's get on with implementing this piece. And I'm going to say products, and also products needs an ID, right? So I need to say this particular ID, and I need to implement get product. Tab it. I'm so spoiled these days with Copilot, I hardly write any code. So I guess it's a good thing, but nevertheless, we have implemented this code now. We have a mapping, and I think that's what Sricharan was pointing out, that we should ideally be having a path. We did not have it. So I have some code here, and I'm assuming Copilot has done its job for me. So I'll stop and restart this application. Okay, it has started again, and I shall go back to Visual Studio Code, and I will clear the logs here. I run the test again. What do you think will happen this time? Hypothesis. Will it pass? Will it fail? If it fails, what will it fail for? Okay, error. What is the error? Any guesses? This contract expected JSON object, but the response contained product. Exactly, data matching. Because the YAML file is expecting an object with name and SKU, right? But what we got back instead is product, right? Because I simply accepted Copilot's recommendation to say, I need to get back a product. Doesn't make sense, right? So let me fix that. So this is typical test-driven development style, right? I run the test, I write a little bit of code, I see if it's red. If it's red, the first thing I do is take it to green, right? That's what I want to do. So I'm going to do new product. I'll give it what it wants. I'll simply say a product. All it wanted is two strings, right? So I'll just say, take a good name of book. So let's say domain-driven design. And I'll call it 123, something like that. And that's it. Now product does not exist. So I'll say alt enter, create a class. I'll put it inside models and factor and create. So it has created a class and it's all done. I'll just quickly alt enter my way to creating fields for this. The same over here. I'll create the fields for this, and then I will generate getters so that I have the serialization works. Basically, I have a product and it has two fields. Like that's what it is, right? That's all I need to satisfy. Fellow was complaining that the error was, I need a JSON object, but you're giving me a string. So now I'm going to try and satisfy that situation. I'm going to return an object instead of a string. Okay, so I'll change this. So with that, we are back to compiling state. Let me rerun the test or rerun the application. Restart it. App is running. Okay, and as usual, I'll ask the same question. Now I'm going to run the test again. What do you anticipate will happen? Will it succeed? Will it fail? Guesses? Going once, going twice. It should succeed. Joshua, okay, thank you. Any other guesses? Anyone guessing against what Joshua is saying? All right, let's see for ourselves. Okay, I save and run. Uh-oh, it's still not passing. What's the issue? It says, I expected name. Key named a name in the specification was not found in the response. Named domain-driven design in the response was not found in the specification. Number in the response was not found in the specification. So what is the mistake I did? I returned an object, but I did not take care of maintaining the names that is there in the specification. Ideally, I should have just named it name and SKU, right? That's what I should have called it. But I was a little generous with the names and I went and called it something else. So now I have to fix my problem, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this refactor rename. I don't want this to be domain driven design. In fact, what it's called is name. And I have to say yes through all this so that the whole thing gets changed. And then I'll rename this to SKU, stock keeping unit. And I'll do the same thing. I've accepted it. You remember the mistake I was making with the stub also, right? When I added price, it said I won't accept it. I'm not happy with what you're doing. I have to, be in line with the specification. The same thing Specmatic is doing for me now. When I'm playing the role of a backend developer, I made a mistake, and it's guiding me that hey, ideally you should have named it according to what is in the spec, and you have not done that. So I have to come and fix it. Good feedback. I have fixed it. Now let's see if I can go back and see whether this will pass again. Again, this time I'll try running the test. And let's see what happens. And hooray, we have the first green. It's always good to celebrate for the first green, right? So it's important. Okay, so notice how I did not write any excessive code, nothing, right? I'm just guided by the API specification. I had free tests and used that test as a way to keep going forward with building to the point where I have something green. Let's continue. Obviously, I've just returned a hard-coded value. This is not useful. I need to take the ID and work with it, right? It doesn't make sense that I can always return something and it will pass. Doesn't make sense. So now what I'll do is I'll say this path variable and string ID has to be used. So usually what I would do is take this ID, maybe pass it down to my service layer. Service layer will pass it down to repository, and that will talk to a database and see if it's finding a product in the database and then return me the data. I will send it back, right? For a moment, let's assume this is the DB code between these two comments. So what I'm going to do is anything other than ID2, I'll say it's not available. I'll throw an exception. So let me say if ID equals 123, or rather if ID not equal to, actually I made a mistake, 1 second. This is not a string, right? This is an integer, right? And then I could say if ID is not equal to 2, then I'm going to throw new runtime exception, product not found. So basically what I'm saying, I'm sort of simulating that my database has only one row, which is product number 2. If it is not there, I will throw an error, and I'm sort of simulating that error. So now I will restart this application. Okay. And application is started. I'll go back to this guy. He's happily passing now. Let me try clearing this out and rerun the test. What do you think will happen? Uh-oh, I got a 500 back. That's not good. 500 is a bad news. I should not have got a 500, but let's park that for a moment. But why did this happen? Let's try and understand the details. So here is the request and response log that Specmatic is logging. The Specmatic said product ID 350. Every time I run, product ID will always be changing because Specmatic just knows that the product ID in the path is a number. The data type is a number. So it will try to keep generating a different number, but it won't lock on to one, right? I need to be able to say, you have to send ID 2. Otherwise, every time I run this, let me run it again. And this time around, it would have tried a different ID. Where is that? Let me clear it. Save and run. Yeah, see, 537. Keeps doing this. It's not useful now, right? Like I can't always have all the possible numbers in my database. It's not possible. I have to have it according to the test data in my system, correct? So how do I fix that? Not to worry. We have a solution in Specmatic. Again, this depends a little bit on GPT magic. So what we do is we say generate examples on this file. Okay, and what we do now is sit and wait for Specmatic to go ahead and start adding the examples. And what do I mean by that? It will figure out that the request, the ID has to send particular value, right? So it'll try to put the value in that for success. And then similarly, it'll try to put the value in the response. So what we have effectively ended up doing is I'm saying that OpenAPI is a test, and this is the input and this is the output. And I'm giving a named example. The named example is basically success here and success here. It connects the two things, right? So OpenAPI itself by specification does not have it. This is a convention that Specmatic is following. So now, based on this sample code that Specmatic has generated for us, I can now go back to this YAML and say this value should always be 2. And this value can be the domain-driven design, you remember? So, and it could be 1, 2, 3, ABC, and that's it. So this is my API specification now. Now what I'm gonna do is go back to this contract test. Let's clear the values and run the test again. What do you think will happen? Success. Hooray, celebrate, because it's a second success. We went from red to green to red again and back to green. And let's read through the data here, right? And this time around, you see, it is actually doing product/2 instead of some 3-digit random number that it was generating. So this is exactly what Specmatic is trying to do, and it will try to prevent you from making any mistakes. So that's what's happening, right? So practically, I could add more tests here. I could, keep on adding more examples here. I could add a failure example. I can simulate that. So practically, all you're doing is you're documenting your API. This is brilliant because for someone who's reading this, like if I take the specification, I copy this just to show you. If I put it in editor.swagger.io, Swagger will also pull out these examples on the UI nicely for you and will show you what's possible, right? So it's very useful documentation for consumer of the API, and for the developer, I can use this as a test. Isn't that brilliant? Cool. So now I'll come back to my picture. So you remember I was saying this is the left-hand side, we did the stubbing. Now we did the right-hand side, we did the testing. Now what this means is I am playing that role of with Specmatic. What we're able to do is achieve that specification thing, right? You remember the electrical socket example I gave? If both parties, the one manufacturing the socket and the one manufacturing the plug, if both parties agree to the same standards and they manufacture to the same standard or build to the same standard, I don't need to do integration testing as much, right? I can be fairly confident that I won't find schema issues. I still need to do some higher level testing for bigger pieces, right? But I don't have to be caught off guard for smaller things. So that's what, in a very high level, this is all contract driven development. These are 2 pillar concepts of contract driven development. If you've got this, it's already like you're about 50-60% along the way. So that's where I'll stop here. Any questions so far or any thoughts? I believe we are also overshooting time now. Nilanjan, should I quickly wrap up?
Yeah, I think that would be nice.
All right, perfect. So there are more to this, right? Like, I can also quickly jump into the deck. What you could do is you can also do code specification versus specification comparison. There's a lot more of that. I think you can go back to our channel and view that on Specmatic. And there's more about central contract repository. I don't think I'll be able to cover that today. And what I would like to do is like leave you with this slide, right? So if you have an OpenAPI specification, and if I use it as a stub, as a consumer, and if the provider uses it as a test, and both of us can be confident in our CI as well as local environments and deploy it to our integration with fair bit of confidence that, in fact, definitely it will work, right? When I integrate it, we are sure about it. So thereby your production is also going to be like without much event, and you're finding issues much earlier, right? Like someone was calling out earlier in the chat also, I guess it was Nilanjan, you can find issues right on your local machine. I don't have to wait for integration testing for this to happen. So that's the sort of end slide I'd leave you with. This is the website, specmatic.in, and like Nilanjan mentioned, Specmatic is also an open source project on Tublian. So if some of you are interested in contributing to the project, more than welcome. And this is my handle on social handles again, and I'd be happy to connect with you. So with that, I'll stop. And if you have any questions, we can always talk later. And thanks again, Precious and Nilanjan. I hope this was helpful. At least I found it interesting talking to all of you. It's quite a good interaction. Thank you.
Yeah, this was amazing. I mean, I will admit that we don't use OpenAPI for our stuff, even though we are heavily microservices based. I just pinged my team that we should definitely take a look at. I do have one question. So I saw you generated examples. Was that like automatically can generate test cases for me, or what?
Yeah, it's in effect you're generating test cases almost automatically by virtue of creating examples. And yeah, but you could pretty much write the example by hand. You're free to do that. There are quite a few examples I can share with you. That
No,
is just
I like generating. I like that.
Sure. Why not? Of course.
Yeah,
so yeah, I mean, you can definitely generate as much as you want, and there are the tooling around OpenAPI specification is definitely getting a lot more mature these days. Very good editor support. Even the Specmatic plugin with VS Code, it helps you take that specification and quickly get on with testing your endpoints, be it your local or your SIT environments. You can just quickly fire it up and try it out. So that's the intention there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, so maybe we'll take 2 minutes, then I'll let Harry go. Is there any other question from anyone? I bet you once you get into, most of you are probably actively looking for opportunity or want to become a professional developer. This is completely a real world challenges. You're going to be working in a team, that team going to be distributed. There are going to be communication issues. All the things that he was showing happened to me in the past, always happens in the project. So any questions, comments? I would really encourage you guys to take a look at OpenAPI, specifically his tool. Maybe we'll figure out something. Maybe we design a challenge in the future and have it somehow integrated to that. That would be fun exercise to do. Any
Absolutely.
questions? Any questions, comments, feedback?
I think there's a question from Jeffrey in the chat box.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So on the chat,
yeah, I am trying to look at the chat. Is it okay, Precious, that I read it directly from there?
yes, it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jeffrey, for the question. Is it Java or which language? Specmatic, the open source project, is Java and Kotlin, the core of it. But if you're asking about where I can use it, you can use it in any language you want. Specmatic also has wrapper projects in Node and Python. Yeah, that's quickly about it. It's largely Kotlin, Java, Python, and Node.js, or rather JavaScript and TypeScript. Any other questions? You can put it in the comment section. That's actually a pretty good way to quickly sort it out. All right. I hope this was helpful.
Yes, it was
and
super.
Over to you, Nilanjan.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Harry, for doing this. Precious, should I? You want to wrap it up? Should I stop the recording? What do you want me to do?
Okay, maybe. Yeah, I think you can stop the recording. You can stop the recording. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming now for this.